Hello everyone, I'm Dusty. Today, we're going to take a close look at a real score report together. This score report was provided by a student who scored 675. Let me first introduce this student's test history. In their first attempt, they scored 595, which was at the 72nd percentile. In the second attempt, they scored 615, reaching the 78th percentile. And in their third attempt, which is the one we're looking at today, they scored 675, placing them at the 95th percentile. Let's really immerse ourselves and take a closer look. How does Dustin conduct the latest data analysis? If you haven't yet watched the video explaining the mechanism behind the data analysis, I strongly recommend you check it out as soon as possible. At the same time, this student has also shared their recollections of the preparation process, which they've included for us. This helps us more accurately reconstruct their situation during the exam. Alright, let's get started. First, we need to note that, as mentioned in previous videos, in addition to recording their thoughts on each question, the test platform also. For a new subject, its initial difficulty will change based on your performance in the previous subject. So, we need to know the order of the exam subjects. The student mentioned that their exam order was quantitative first, then DI, and finally verbal. Therefore, when we simulate later, we'll follow this order. Let's first take a look at their first subject in the exam. Quantitative. Looking at this math score, you can probably guess what it looks like, right? It should be a perfect score. That's right, the student did get all the answers correct in the exam. However, there are two details worth noting here. First, they didn't get everything right from the start. It was only in the last minute that they corrected two previously wrong questions. When we simulate the scoring mechanism, we will count these two questions as incorrect at first, because you only corrected them afterwards. The system will add the points back for you after you fix them, that's correct. However, making mistakes at the time will cause your ability to be initially underestimated during the ability estimation process, and the questions given to you will also be relatively easier as a result. So let's take a look. In fact, the simulated curve for math looks like this. All the questions at the beginning were answered correctly, and since this is the first subject, the starting point is 0. All the questions at the beginning were answered correctly. But if you get questions 12 and 13 wrong, because your previous estimated ability was really high, even though these two questions are difficult, making mistakes on them will cause your estimated ability to drop by a relatively larger margin. So what happens next? Originally, if these two questions hadn't been corrected, the score would have been around the 90th to 95th percentile. But because these two questions were corrected, in the end, there were actually no mistakes at all. So the system ended up giving a perfect score in the 90s and a 100th percentile ranking. In this process, we can also see that all the questions he answered were of extremely high difficulty. Of course, this extremely high difficulty is in comparison to all test takers worldwide. For us, some of these questions might still feel relatively easy. However, this student did not rush through the easier questions, even if he happened to encounter some problems he had seen before. There is still a method to it. As Dusty mentioned before, be careful the GMAT can detect if you are answering questions improperly or behaving abnormally during the test. And he made sure to limit himself to checking his work only once. In our previous videos, we have mentioned that your test-taking strategy should be to avoid making the system think you are guessing or leaking questions. So even if you feel you solved this math question very quickly, or it seems familiar to you, please make sure to double-check your answer at least once. Try to keep your time as short as possible, ideally around 1 minute, because we never know what criteria the system uses to evaluate us. So do your best not to let it think you are guessing, or that you're not actually working on the problem. So this student also paid attention to this. Even though the question was repeated, he still worked through the solution afterwards, which is something all students should learn from. So what happened next? This student finished the math section. Of course, in this case, he got a perfect score, so there's really nothing that needs improvement. However, if he were to work on strengthening his skills, we would focus on the questions that took him longer to solve during the exam, as well as the questions he initially got wrong, but later corrected specifically, what kinds of questions those were. Since this student didn't provide a full set, let's move on and take a look at the next one. For the second student, the subject he worked on was section DI. In this section, we simulated based on the questions he answered, which are listed here. Questions 4, 6, 8, 16, and 18, a total of 5 questions. After completing all of them, he did not make any corrections to any of the questions. Alright, so we'll use this data for our simulation. Of course, during the simulation, I need to make a small adjustment, which is to set his starting point at the position of 2 thetas. This adjustment may not be exactly the same as the official one, but since we're just running a simulation and, because he got a perfect score on the previous set of questions, we'll choose to start from a higher point. As a result, the difficulty of the questions he received at the beginning was indeed very high. Okay, so as we can see in the simulation process, the main factors that significantly affect the score estimation are actually the first 8 questions. For example, questions 4, 6, and 8 have a relatively large impact on the fluctuation of the score estimate, while after the 8th question, such as the 16th and 18th questions, the adjustments are relatively minor. So, what does this mean? We can then focus on studying the difficulty of these particular areas, which, as you can see, are extremely challenging. So for this student, in their upcoming practice, if they focus on DS's rapid learning related questions, DS's math related questions, and the 3 MSR questions, they should concentrate on practicing high difficulty problems in these areas. Of course, there's a small detail here. Since the GMAT format has been online for less than a year, as of today, the 30th of October 2024, and the newly added non-math DST in the mindset section may not have gathered enough data yet, there's a strong possibility that this particular question actually is an unscored test question. But we can't be sure, because the official sources never reveal which questions are test questions. So it's possible that even though this question was answered incorrectly, it wasn't actually counted. Also, we can observe that this student completed the DS section quite quickly, in just 1.5 minutes, so it's possible they were in a hurry to leave. If this student had remembered to note what this particular Math DS question right after finishing the MSR was about during the actual exam, then our post-exam coaching could be more targeted to strengthen their weaknesses in this area. Another point to pay attention to is that towards the end of the exam, the difficulty actually drops a bit. It's no longer at the highest level, and could be just at a normal high difficulty level, or even approaching medium difficulty. We can't be certain. This is because the data we use here can't fully reveal how the official question bank distributes question difficulties. So even though it looks like these are very difficult questions, it's also possible that the official questions are different. The difficulty has already dropped to the medium level. When we realize that the questions here are actually easier than the previous ones, you can see that earlier, the student was able to correctly answer more difficult table questions, but later on, when the difficulty was relatively lower, they still got the GT question wrong. Alright, we can interpret this as the student's GT performance not being very stable under time pressure. Therefore, it's recommended that this student maintain a high level of difficulty when practicing GT plans as usual, but also focus on improving problem-solving proficiency and efficiency. This is our current analysis of the DI section. Finally, let's look at where the student ended up at this point. It's also quite close. In the end, we see that the system estimated his performance at the 84th percentile. Now, let's look at the third subject he took, which is called verbal. Since the assessment here didn't reach a perfect score like before, but rather the 84th percentile, so in the parameter settings, I set the starting point for verbal at about 1. Of course, this is just an estimate. And as we can see in verbal, this student's performance shows that he got more questions wrong. We can see that he got questions 1, 6, 7, 10, 12, 14, and then a streak of mistakes from 16 to 20, all incorrect. Of course, in the design, I included all of this as well. This student also didn't go back to change any answers later. Okay, let's look at the results we got. As you can see, this student's final verbal percentile is 57th percentile, which is actually quite close to our final estimated outcome. Now, let's look at the process in the middle and see which questions have a greater impact on the score estimation, and which questions are the ones I got wrong but shouldn't have. We can see in the verbal section that, roughly in the earlier part of the test, the questions have a significant impact on the percentile estimation. This corresponds to what we mentioned earlier. For the first 8 questions or so, students can appropriately spend a bit more time on each question, about an extra half a minute per question, to carefully check their answers. Try not to use the mark for review or change answer function just yet, because mistakes in this section will seriously affect your score estimation. Even if you come back later and correct it, the damage is already done when it pushes you back to an easier difficulty level. You might make up the points, but it has already moved you from the 3-point line back to the 2-point line, which reduces your potential to perform. Alright, so as we can see, this student first answered the first question, which is actually a medium level question. Next, of course, they moved on to the medium difficulty section. They got the second question right, the third question right, and the fourth question right as well. We can observe that questions 3, 4, and 5 are all medium to high difficulty RC questions, and they got all of them correct. However, on the 6th question, which was a very high difficulty CR, they got it wrong. On the 7th question, another very high difficulty CR, they also got it wrong. These are all quite normal occurrences, because the CR questions here have already reached a very high level of difficulty. Next, let's take a look. Because these 2 questions were answered incorrectly, the estimated score drops. Then, at the next incorrect question, which is question 10, the difficulty of question 10 is similar to that of questions 8 and 9, as they are part of the same set. We can see that questions 8, 9, and 10 are all in the high difficulty range. It's observable that the difficulty of question 10 is around 1.83 here, and compared to question 5, which was the same type of question 5 was even harder, at a difficulty of 2.0. Yet, despite question 10 being slightly easier, it was answered incorrectly. So this student may need to re-examine their problem-solving process for RC Infer idea questions during regular practice. Also, since this is an RC question, it's possible that the mistake was due to a misunderstanding of the passage itself, though this is less likely, because if the error was caused by a misinterpretation of the passage, there will be 2 other signs. First, the reading time will be noticeably longer than for other questions that were answered correctly, especially for the first question. Second, for state idea questions which ask about the literal meaning or the main idea of the passage, the performance would theoretically be worse. So here, we tend to think that when this student is working on infer idea questions, it's possible that the process of breaking down the question wasn't done well, or that inappropriate or overreaching inferences were made. Now let's look at questions 12 to 14. The student got question 12 and question 14 wrong, but actually, this doesn't have a significant impact on the overall score. The fluctuations have already entered the fine-tuning stage. Here we can see that questions 12 and 14 are actually both quite difficult. Of course, compared to the earlier questions, the difficulty is about the same. But why is the performance here less stable? So if at this point the student can recall what the third passage was testing, or the obstacles they encountered while working on it, especially with this particular question, they should still remember any significant difficulties they faced. That's because the time spent on this question was clearly much longer than the time they usually spend on other inference questions. This indicates that he encountered problems while working on it. Of course, if he can recall exactly what issues he faced during the process, we can provide more targeted support and help him design a remediation plan. Additionally, there must have been some misunderstanding of the article itself, since he got one question wrong. So we need to dig deeper and ask the student, what type of article was the third reading passage, and what story did it tell? Which parts did he feel uncertain about while reading? It's most likely that he misunderstood some part of the information in this article. Now let's look at question 16. At this point, the difficulty has clearly dropped to a level even lower than most of the CR questions he did earlier, although its impact on the score is just a minor adjustment. But then, doing too many low difficulty questions is an anomaly. Clearly, earlier questions like question 2 and question 11, which were of higher difficulty and the same type, he was able to answer correctly. But for question 16, which is relatively easier, he got it wrong. If we confirm that both this question and that question are basic face value questions, it means that the student needs to revisit and practice this area during regular study. Alright, we need to especially reinforce and consolidate this. So in the regular study plan, we will help the students strengthen their practice with high difficulty face value questions, including predicting and analyzing the structure of articles, reviewing and training in logical vocabulary, and targeted practice with office type questions. Next, for questions 18, 19, and 20, all of them were answered incorrectly. So this entire passage was answered incorrectly. Actually, my assessment is that it's quite likely this student was under time pressure. You can see that the student mentioned this passage was relatively very long, and theoretically, the time spent on the first question, which includes the time to read the passages, should not be shorter than the time spent on the previous shorter passages. Furthermore, considering that Lee was just able to handle such difficult questions and managed to get all correct or only missed one in the previous sets, their reading ability shouldn't be so lacking as to get all 4 questions wrong here. So, rather than attributing these mistakes to a lack of ability, it's more likely that the errors were due to the student's pace in answering the questions. Unable to handle the tricky questions, but that's alright because the student used the correct test-taking strategy. His strategy was to spend a bit more time on the first 7 to 8 questions. In the middle section, if he felt that a question was too difficult to handle, he would bravely cut his losses and save time for later. And at the end, focus on the questions you are confident about, letting the system help you fine-tune your score. So, we can infer from this that the student probably felt some time pressure during the test, and proactively managed his time so that he could finish the last questions. In the end, the student also said he was lucky he had to stop at the last CR question to save his score. At the same time, this once again affirms the importance of promptly assessing the situation and decisively giving up on questions you can't handle, bravely cutting your losses. So even though this student got 4 questions wrong in a row here, an entire set of questions, and his percentile dropped, fortunately he managed to stop in time in the middle of the section. At the end, he was able to come back and take control of the CRT section that he was more skilled at. So if you look at the last CRT planning and construction questions, the difficulty level dropped, but because his ability in this area is solid, he was able to handle them confidently. From this, we can infer that when this student practices regularly, if it's analysis and critic sections, special attention needs to be paid to reminders about ball face. For planning and construction questions, it's enough to just practice the most difficult problems. As for RCE, the focus should be on strengthening inference question types and function questions. Additionally, for application questions and LRC logic questions, these fall under the category of inferring ideas. We need to re-examine this student's inference solving process to see if there is an issue with over-inference, and we also need to determine whether the student encountered any specific reading obstacles in this particular passage. What is the subject matter of this reading? What is its content? What does the structure of the article look like? We need to thoroughly understand all of these aspects. Of course, this student's reading speed can also be further improved. Only in this way can we ensure that even if we don't spend much time at the beginning next time, we can still finish writing calmly in the end. Alright, as you can see here, this student also made some additions. Indeed, this student made a difficult and courageous decision here regarding the final RCT, which they couldn't quite grasp because they remembered what was mentioned before. The score for the disease section is already a matter of fine-tuning, but if you don't finish the exam in the end, the points deducted for not completing it are much greater, and the difference is significant. Therefore, this student decided to save 10 minutes to tackle the final CR question. You can all notice this student's wise judgment. He didn't wait until the very end. Instead, when he realized midway he couldn't understand the question, he decisively guessed the answer. If he had invested his time here, he might have only gotten 1 or 2 questions right, but if he ran out of time and couldn't answer, the point deduction would be extremely severe. Alright, congratulations to this student for reaching the 95th percentile in total score, outperforming 95% of the test takers. Now, after seeing our transcript analysis, do you also feel a desire to know more details about your own transcript? You're welcome to contact Dustin's Terminator course. We'll use the same tools to help you analyze your transcript, and based on the details we find, we'll create a personalized study plan and test preparation strategy just for you. I'm Dustin. See you next time. Bye bye.